This paper was presented as part of Panel 3, Awakening to Woke, of the Free Association's webinar on Authoritarianism, September 31st, 2023. It will appear in a forthcoming issue of the journal Free Associations. The title of the paper is Superego, Our Inner Authoritarian. In attempting to work out our stance toward the many pressing moral, social, and political issues of the day, we can become so focused on the ends we seek to promote and the evils we oppose that we lose sight of the question of the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the means we intend to employ. Those who simply assume the ends justify the means don't have to think about this. So convinced are they of the righteousness of their cause that other values, such as free speech and democratic principles, are expendable. As a politically naive young man, I was so focused on the evils I opposed that I associated myself with like-minded comrades, but failed to notice that we differed widely with respect to the methods or strategies to be employed in pursuit of our common aims. These scales began to fall when I was soon invited to join secret committees devoted to caucusing, plotting, and manipulating the wider movement. I well recall an enthusiastic comrade attempting to allay my fears and belie my scruples by introducing me to the subtle doctrine of, quotes, democratic centralism, unquote. My thoughts went to Orwell and doublespeak, and I began to recognize my Menshevism, my social democratic commitment to both a Marxian critique of capitalism and anti-authoritarian principles, procedures, and attitudes. While excellent work on right-wing authoritarianism has been done by political psychologists, some, such as Robert Altemeyer, see Carveth 2004, have tended to turn a blind eye toward left-wing authoritarianism. While many of us who have backgrounds in social science have long been woke to varying degrees, alert to class, gender, racial, generational, and related patterns of social injustice, today we see that many of those who share our emancipatory aims have taken to pursuing them in distinctly authoritarian ways. Although it is not easy to critique those with whom we share many values, it is nevertheless incumbent upon the woke who are not authoritarian to call out the woke who are. Regrettably, Freud, too, had his secret committee, see Grosskreutz, 1991. He organized the IPA along patriarchal, hierarchical lines such that former Bolsheviks, card-carrying members of the CPUSA, such as Charles Brenner, Jacob Arlo, and Ralph Greenson, see Arnie Richards, 2018, could feel quite at home there. On entering New York Harbor in 1909, Freud is reputed to have said, quotes, "They don't realize we are bringing them the plague," unquote. I like to think that what he had in mind was his demonstration of our intrinsic contradictoriness, that there is no unitary ego, that we are all permanently divided selves, all both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Melanie Klein reaffirmed his insight through her elaboration of the two distinct mental worlds between which we oscillate throughout our lives. When possessed by a bad mood, I bark at my wife and later apologize, saying, "Sorry, honey, I wasn't myself." I'm lying. The truth is, I was myself in the paranoid schizoid position. Because we have no unitary self, we cannot entirely trust our judgment, for we have another self who may judge very differently. Even while announcing my Menshevism, my inner Bolshevik may be stirring. The PS world is characterized by narcissism, omnipotence, splitting, and envy. The depressive reparative, D, by object love, dependence, concern, and gratitude. The PS world is the home of authoritarianism. Democracy depends upon the advance into D. Authority in PS is represented by the sadistic authoritarian superego. In D, it takes the form of a humanistic conscience. The superego is formed out of both Oedipal and pre-Oedipal reactive, as distinct from primary aggression turned back against the self, plus internalization of parental and social authority. Although in his sociological work, Freud described it as something like a good cop, saving us from a descent into barbarism, over time in his clinical work, he described it in increasingly harsh, sadistic, and tyrannical terms, and viewed it as at the root of most psychopathology. For Freud, the superego is formed through submission to the Oedipal rival due to castration anxiety, and operates thereafter, quotes, like a garrison in a conquered city, unquote. Melanie Klein finds its origin much earlier in internalization of and identification with the all-bad persecutory part object. I hold that the roots of conscience as distinct from superego lie in our primate inheritance and early internalization of and identification with the good part object, and more generally, with the nurturers who kept us alive. In our masochism, we submit to the superego. In our sadism, we identify with it and, marching under its banner, deploy its aggression against scapegoats, sometimes developing what Heinrich Racker called a mania for reproaching. In enacting superego aggression against self and others, we are out of sync with conscience. Only by developing and aligning ourselves with our biologically grounded conscience, our true self, are we empowered to stand up to inner and outer tyranny. As our inner authoritarian, the superego can function like a fifth column. In our struggles against authoritarianism, we ourselves can easily become authoritarian. For authoritarianism is a part, but not the whole of our nature. Those of us who oppose it in the name of democratic principles need to keep it under regular surveillance. Franz Alexander saw the superego as a vestigial organ. Freud called for its demolition. Ferenczi argued no analysis can be complete without its complete elimination. Although James Strachey saw the severity of the superego and its central role in psychopathology, against the radicalism of Freud, Alexander, and Ferenczi, he called for its modification rather than its demolition. He was right to do so for two reasons. First, Freud, Alexander, and Ferenczi were naive to think that the moral functions could be handed over to the rational ego. We have known since the 18th century work of David Hume that reason cannot deduce an ought from an is. Science is descriptive, not prescriptive. It can tell us how to build a bridge, but not whether we ought to. Second, we need the law, a rule book, even though the socially constructed norms are culturally relative. But while he was correct to call for modification rather than elimination of the superego, Strachey gave us no clue as to how we are to know in what directions it ought to be modified. The very value judgment that the superego ought to be modified comes from somewhere. What is the source of that value judgment? it seems we need a judge to judge the judge. It is for this reason that I call for us to reverse Freud's 1923 decision to fold conscience and ego ideal into superego, and instead posit conscience as a separate psychic structure and function capable of conflicting with judging and calling the superego to account. Such a conscience may be conceived either as a separate mental structure, along with id, ego, superego, and ego ideal, yielding a 5-structure model of the mind, or as having its roots in the pro-social as distinct from the anti-social part of the id. The distinction between conscience and superego has its roots in the New Testament. In psychoanalytic discourse, it was prefigured as early as 1950 in Erich Fromm's distinction between authoritarian and humanistic conscience. In a remarkable 1958 essay, Carl Gustav Jung clearly differentiates conscience from superego and argues that conscience has an archetypal basis, by which I understand him to mean a natural foundation. Just as Bowlby argues that, like other primates, we come into the world with an unlearned need for attachment, so, like other primates, we arrive with unlearned needs to respond altruistically to our fellows. See the work of Duvall, 1997. Paul Bloom's 2010-2013 research at Yale shows that infants as young as 3 months of age already have a rudimentary conscience, preferring characters who help others over those who obstruct or frustrate them. I'm often asked how in the clinical situation we are to distinguish the voice of conscience from that of the superego. While some superegos are more authoritarian than others, the superego generally speaks in a language that is more or less harsh, dictatorial, dogmatic, and unforgiving. In contrast, although conscience has a bite, it generally speaks in the language of love and concern. It does not wish to punish, berate, or humiliate, but only to call the errant subject back to conscientiousness, and like the father of the prodigal son, to welcome him home. In what some see as the war currently dividing American psychoanalysts, the proponents of CSJT, critical social justice theory, are full of political passion and moral indignation. Whether their call for psychoanalysts to become activists means outside the clinical consulting room or inside it as well is not always clear. The idea of carrying our political, religious, or other passions into the clinic would seem to be truly incompatible with the time-honored ideals of abstinence and technical neutrality. Without the ongoing struggle to contain our countertransference, psychoanalysis would be displaced in favor of education, indoctrination, or conversion. Instead of analyzing a patient, it would be a matter of urging him to become a mini-me. There's no doubt a parallel danger on the other side, being so dispassionately ensconced in D that one becomes complacent in the face of the serious issues of the day. This is the pathology of D. On the other hand, the therapist's forbearance, self-control, even at times self-abnegation, preserve the essential boundaries that make analysis possible. We have in need a superego, but we also need a conscience. We live at times in PS and strive to advance into D. Beyond oscillating between these polarities, we might at times manage to advance dialectically to a kind of transitional area in which we can do justice to both. This is an ideal from which we usually fall short, but it is an ideal worth striving toward. Well, we need to be woke to the varieties of injustice pervading our world. We at the same time need to awaken to how our very wokeness can manifest as authoritarianism. Woke ends do not justify authoritarian means. People on the right have long sought deregulation. Those of us on the left must disavow the flight from guilt and regulation and embrace a superego modified and disciplined by conscience. Thank you.